Germany, April 1946. A pale sun rises over the ruins of Frankfurt. The air still smells faintly of ash and damp stone. Streets once crowded with streetcars are silent except for boots on gravel and the faint clatter of tin. A U.S. Army private kneels beside the shattered fountain at the square's edge. In his hand, a dented C-ration can. Inside, cold beans and half a biscuit. He looks at the child watching him. Thin, barefoot, maybe 8 years old, clutching a rusted spoon. The private hesitates, then splits the portion evenly down the middle. Steam rises briefly in the chill air as the boy accepts his share without a word. Behind them, a poster flaps on a cracked wall. No fraternization with German civilians. The wind tears at its corner, exposing the brick beneath, a wall built for war, now crumbling into hunger. What began as a single soldier's impulse to share would ripple through entire towns, convoys and policies, transforming an army of conquerors into reluctant caretakers. Because by 1946, Germany wasn't just defeated, it was starving, and the Americans had food. May 1945. Germany had surrendered. The guns of Europe fell silent, but hunger was just beginning its campaign. Cities from Cologne to Dresden were skeletons, rail lines torn apart by bombing, grain silos burned, fields left unplowed for years. The Allied victory brought peace, but also the task of keeping 70 million civilians alive amid total collapse. When the U.S. 3rd and 7th Armies moved deeper into occupied territory, their maps marked bridges and depots, not bakeries or farms. The food problem arrived as an afterthought. American logistics had been designed for soldiers, not civilians. And yet, as spring turned to summer, every corner of the American zone filled with the same scenes. Gray faces, thin arms, the dull stare of malnutrition. By July, intelligence officers were reporting calorie intakes among German civilians as low as 1,000 to 1,200 calories per day, less than half the recommended minimum. Industrial workers fainted on assembly lines. Children scavenged potato peels from garbage cans outside. GI kitchens. The winter ahead was already being whispered about in staff tents as the hunger. Winter. The Allied Control Council had divided Germany into 4 zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. In theory, food distribution was coordinated through the Allied Kommandatura in Berlin. In reality, each zone was left to improvise. The Soviets requisitioned heavily, moving grain eastward as reparations. The French, struggling with shortages at home, sealed their borders tightly. The British shared what they could from their empire, and the Americans, blessed with overflowing supply ships in Bremen and Bremerhaven, found themselves both guardians and gatekeepers of survival. Yet official U.S. policy at first forbade compassion. In May 1945, General Eisenhower's directive on non-fraternization explicitly banned American personnel from social contact with German civilians, even children. Soldiers were not to talk, assist, or give food to locals. The intent was clear: prevent sympathy from softening the edge of occupation. Germany had just slaughtered millions. Its population was not to be pitied, but in practice, reality began to erode discipline faster than any order could reinforce it. American units bivouacked near towns soon realized the scale of deprivation. Children loitered near gates at mealtimes. Women traded jewelry for a crust of bread. Military police found themselves dispersing crowds around refuse pits. One GI in Nuremberg wrote home, "We dump leftovers, and they're gone before they hit the ground. I stopped looking." The moral weight grew daily. Chaplains reported serious distress among men ordered to ignore starving civilians. Commanders petitioned headquarters for clarification. Could they give scraps? Soup leftovers? Canned goods? For months, the official answer was no. Meanwhile, back home, Americans were reading in newspapers about German starvation. By late 1945, President Truman's administration began receiving letters from churches and veterans' families, urging mercy for the defeated. The Office of Military Government, U.S. Zone, OMGUS, led by General Lucius D. Clay, was forced to balance two opposites: the need for denazification and justice, and the human imperative not to let millions die. Logistics dictated part of the story. The U.S. Army's own ration system was a marvel of consistency. Every soldier in occupied Germany received roughly 2,800 to 3,000 calories per day, usually divided into 3 standardized meals. The iconic C-ration contained canned meat, biscuits, sugar, instant coffee, and powdered lemonade. The K-ration, designed for mobility, came in waxed cartons: breakfast, dinner, supper, totaling about 2,830 calories. To a soldier, it was monotonous. To a starving civilian, it was wealth. And so began the quiet rebellion. A chocolate bar slipped through a fence, half a can of beans shared after patrol. D-ration bars, dense, bitter chocolate designed to sustain a man for a day, cut into quarters and handed to wide-eyed children. Some called it charity, others called it disobedience. In truth, it was the earliest spark of something larger, a shift in the moral identity of the occupation. The U.S. Army had come to control Germany. Within months, it began to feed it. By the autumn of 1945, the hunger that began in rubble-strewn cities had spread across the countryside. Even in fertile regions like Bavaria and Hesse, harvests were disastrous. Bombing had crippled transport. Fertilizer was scarce. Fuel for tractors nearly non-existent. Trains that once carried grain to the cities now lay rusting on broken rails. What little food remained was swallowed by an impossible equation: more mouths, fewer fields. Over 12 million ethnic German refugees were flooding in from the east. Expelled from Silesia, Pomerania, and the Sudetenland, they arrived with nothing but bundles, overwhelming every town's ability to shelter or feed them. Bread lines doubled overnight. Local authorities, already dependent on U.S. military allocations, begged for relief. The numbers told the story starkly. In early 1946, the official daily ration for civilians in many parts of the U.S. zone fell to 1,275 calories, but actual intake often dropped below 1,000. For the average German worker, that meant a diet consisting of watery turnip soup, ersatz coffee, and a thin slice of bread. Meat was almost mythical. Malnutrition began manifesting in clinics: anemia, edema, stunted growth. The black market exploded. Cigarettes became currency. A single American Lucky Strike could buy a loaf of bread. A tin of Spam could fetch a week's wages. U.S. military patrols tried to curb illegal trade, but even MPs often turned a blind eye, sometimes participating in barter themselves. "You could outlaw kindness," one captain wrote, "but you couldn't enforce it." The Trümmerkinder, or rubble children, became an icon of this time. Small figures moving through the ruins, scavenging nails, bricks, or coal dust to sell. Many were orphans. Others had parents too weak to work. To GIs, these children blurred the line between former enemy and innocent victim. A generation of American soldiers, many not much older than the kids themselves, faced a moral test the battlefield had never prepared them for. Officially, fraternization rules still stood. Posters in mess halls warned, "Feeding civilians aids the enemy." Yet by late 1945, General Clay and the military government began quietly softening their stance. The policy was unsustainable. Units in the field could not, in good conscience, watch children starve while they carried surplus rations. Clay, a pragmatic engineer turned administrator, recognized the political stakes. "We cannot win the peace on empty stomachs," he told Washington. Under his guidance, the U.S. zone began organizing emergency feeding programs in cooperation with the UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and later, CARE, Cooperative for American Remittances to Europe. But bureaucracy moved slowly, much slower than hunger. Shipments had to be approved, transported, inventoried, and distributed through shattered infrastructure. And while officials debated tonnage in Berlin, soldiers continued to improvise at ground level. By the winter of 1946–47, conditions reached a breaking point. That season would be remembered in German diaries as the Hunger Winter. Rivers froze solid. Coal shipments stalled. People burned furniture for warmth. Bread rations dropped again. Some districts reported 900 calories per day on average. Hospitals filled with cases of starvation-induced illness. Mortality among children and the elderly spiked. And yet, amid the crisis, the image of the American soldier feeding a child began to spread. Not through propaganda, but through word of mouth. It started with individual acts. A private sharing canned beans in Kassel, a medic boiling soup for refugees in Würzburg, an engineer who built a makeshift oven for an orphanage. German newspapers, newly licensed by the occupation, cautiously began reporting such incidents, framing them as gestures of reconciliation. The moral optics were not lost on Washington. In a war that had been fought partly to win hearts and minds, feeding the former enemy became a form of strategic compassion. The emerging Cold War sharpened that point. The Soviet zone, though equally hungry, used food scarcity as control. In contrast, American officials began to see nourishment as diplomacy. By 1947, the United States had already shipped over 5 million tons of food to occupied Europe, much of it redirected from military reserves. While the policy was bureaucratically justified as stabilization, its emotional effect was deeper. To millions of Germans, the soldiers who had once represented defeat now represented survival. And still, in the smallest gestures, a chocolate bar, a slice of bread, a spoonful of stew, the human side of occupation endured. Every unofficial ration shared between a GI and a child was a quiet act of rebellion against bitterness, bureaucracy, and the inertia of war. It was within these moments, played out in thousands of streets and kitchens, that the story of post-war Germany's rebirth began. No order compelled them. No manual prepared them. Most American GIs in post-war Germany were 20-year-olds who had never seen real hunger before. The devastation stunned them. Mothers boiling weeds for soup, children with bellies swollen from malnutrition, and old men collapsing in ration lines. For soldiers who had survived Ardennes or Normandy, the war had been brutal but simple. The enemy shot back. Now, the enemy begged, and that changed everything. Letters home reveal a quiet moral awakening. One private wrote to his mother in Ohio, "They told us not to feed them, but you can't look at a hungry kid and eat your beans in peace." Another, stationed in Stuttgart, described tossing crusts over a fence each night until the sergeant stopped pretending not to see. Acts of kindness spread organically. Field kitchens in ruined towns began setting aside kiddie cans, unofficial portions filled from leftovers. Engineers building bridges carried extra D-bars in their pockets. Nurses in military hospitals smuggled powdered milk to local clinics. For the children, the Americans became walking miracles. They called them Die Schokoladensoldaten, the chocolate soldiers. A single Hershey bar could turn suspicion into trust. The occupation, once marked by fear and humiliation, slowly softened at its edges. These soldiers were not politicians, but in the eyes of German families, they became ambassadors of a new kind of power. Mercy backed by discipline, generosity shaped by structure. In those encounters, America's post-war image was being rewritten, not in press releases, but in shared meals. The paradox of post-war policy was this: the Allies wanted to punish Germany, but not kill it. The difference, by 1946, came down to calories. The Morgenthau Plan, proposed near the end of the war, had imagined a permanently deindustrialized Germany, an agrarian nation stripped of heavy industry. Though quickly abandoned as impractical, its spirit lingered. Denazification and demilitarization dominated the early occupation mindset. Feeding the population was seen as charity, not obligation. When reports of starvation began to circulate, the American command found itself trapped between image and reality. On paper, they administered a former enemy. On the ground, they faced humanitarian catastrophe. General Lucius D. Clay, the American military governor, quietly altered course. Without fanfare, he instructed officers to treat civilian feeding as part of stability operations. "You cannot teach democracy to an empty stomach," he noted in his diary. By late 1946, Clay's office authorized limited ration supplementation for the most vulnerable. Hospitals, orphanages, schools. Civilian committees were reactivated under supervision to coordinate distribution. The same bureaucracy once used to feed Wehrmacht garrisons now fed children, yet tension persisted. Some American senators warned against feeding Nazis. Conservative voices in the U.S. argued that German suffering was deserved retribution. But Clay and his officers countered that hunger bred chaos, and chaos invited communism. The logic of containment was already forming. Food as foreign policy. This shift marked one of the earliest instances of what historians later called soft power. Feeding, once an act of guilt, became strategy. The soldiers who had shared rations instinctively were now backed, indirectly, by policy catching up to morality. In 1946, nutritionists working with the U.S. Army's Medical Corps began documenting calorie data across the occupation zones. Their findings were grim. At 1,000 calories per day, the average German worker lost nearly 10% of body weight within a month. Vitamin deficiencies led to rickets in children, scurvy among adults, and widespread anemia. Medical reports warned that an entire generation risked permanent developmental damage. Even a small supplement could reverse decline. A single 400-calorie can of U.S. C-rations, typically meat and beans, provided nearly one-third of a day's survival need. A D-bar contained enough concentrated energy to sustain a child for 24 hours. Doctors stationed in Heidelberg and Frankfurt began informal studies, noting that neighborhoods near U.S. bases showed markedly lower child mortality rates. Where GIs shared rations, nutrition improved. Measurable, not anecdotal. Humanitarian agencies took notice. Care packages, funded by American citizens, began arriving by mid-1946. Each box contained 20 pounds of food: powdered milk, sugar, coffee, and lard. Within months, thousands of parcels were delivered across U.S. and British zones. For many Germans, it was their first encounter with organized charity from abroad. What started as spontaneous generosity had become structured compassion, supported by logistics, measured in calories, and documented in medical reports. Every spoonful of soup handed to a child was more than comfort. It was a quiet victory against despair, a physiological line between recovery and collapse. Feeding an army had been America's wartime strength. Feeding a broken nation was an entirely new challenge. The U.S. military inherited a logistical empire. Convoys, depots, bakeries, and fuel networks designed to move food across continents. When Germany surrendered, those same arteries were still pumping, now with no battle to fight, but millions of mouths to serve. In Bremen and Bremerhaven, American supply ships unloaded mountains of crates marked U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. Inside, canned beef, flour, powdered milk, and dehydrated potatoes. These supplies had been meant for invasion campaigns that never came. By 1946, they became the backbone of survival in the western zones. But distribution was chaos. Bridges were out, roads bombed, Trains derailed. To move 1 ton of flour from a port to a village often took 10 times the fuel it had before the war. Engineers improvised, rebuilding rail tracks by hand, restoring warehouses, converting troop trucks into rolling bakeries. Each region developed its own rhythm. In Bavaria, the U.S. Army partnered with local mayors to form Küchenkommandos, soup kitchens supervised by military officers but staffed by German women. In Hesse, surplus field kitchens from disbanded regiments were repurposed to feed civilians twice daily. Yet, for every meal served, thousands still went hungry. Clay's reports to Washington described an impossible arithmetic. 70 million people, 3 million tons of food, short. America could ship in calories, but not fast enough to offset production losses. Still, even limited relief had impact. The presence of well-fed GIs carrying crates through ruined towns sent a message stronger than leaflets ever could. The victors had not come to annihilate, but to rebuild. In the first months after victory, the American public saw Germans as the architects of destruction. Sympathy was minimal. Newspapers featured headlines about Nuremberg, not hunger. Yet photographs began to emerge. Gaunt children clutching candy wrappers, women lined up at U.S. Army soup kitchens, and young soldiers smiling awkwardly beside them. General Lucius D. Clay understood the optics. He had seen how public opinion shaped policy during the war. Now he used the same principles for peace. Without fanfare, he allowed journalists and Red Cross photographers to document relief efforts. Every image of an American soldier handing food to a German child became silent propaganda. Not for conquest, but for civilization. In 1947, the U.S. Information Control Division, initially tasked with censorship, pivoted to reorientation. Instead of silencing, they began showing. Newsreels featured images of American compassion. Churches in the U.S. organized food drives, encouraged by stories of soldiers defying hunger. It worked. By mid-1947, the tone of coverage had changed. Former enemies were now people in need. Humanitarianism became a badge of moral superiority in the early Cold War narrative. Clay's leadership, however, was not merely optical. He saw compassion as policy. When Washington debated cutting food aid to Germany to conserve U.S. reserves, Clay wired directly. To let people starve in occupied zones would be a crime, and a gift to Moscow. His warning resonated. By late 1947, official U.S. doctrine had shifted. Occupation would no longer mean punishment, but partnership. Feeding the defeated became a demonstration of strength and a lesson in the politics of mercy. Across the Elbe River, in the Soviet zone, the same winter brought a different story. Moscow's administration viewed food as leverage. Grain shipments from eastern Germany were redirected toward the Soviet Union as reparations. Collective farms were enforced. Ration cards favored workers in priority industries aligned with socialist reconstruction. The result was a hierarchy of survival. Political loyalty measured in calories. Propaganda painted the Western Allies as exploiters. Radio broadcasts accused the Americans of hoarding food, claiming that German starvation was proof of capitalist cruelty. But the contrast on the ground undermined the narrative. Refugees fleeing east to west described American zones where children received milk, schools reopened, and care parcels arrived by train. Soviet intelligence noted the shift uneasily. Reports from Berlin in 1947 warned that Western feeding programs are altering attitudes rapidly among youth. Indeed, the moral theater of food was becoming one of the Cold War's first battlegrounds. In 1948, as the Soviet Union tightened its grip on the eastern sector, the Western Allies responded not with tanks, but with airlifts. The seed of that policy was planted not in generals' war rooms, but in countless daily acts of generosity between soldiers and starving civilians. Food once a symbol of domination, had become the front line of ideology. It began quietly, almost invisibly. The first signs were not riots or protests, but the color of people's faces. By January 1947, doctors in Frankfurt and Kassel noted a new pallor among the population: grayish skin, brittle hair, slowed pulse. The medical term was protein deficiency. The street term was starvation. The hunger winter came after 2 years of cumulative collapse. Germany's 1946 harvest had been catastrophic. Late spring frost, followed by heavy rains that destroyed nearly half the potato crop. The Rhine froze solid in December, halting coal and grain transport. Bakeries shut down for lack of fuel. Families burned books, furniture, even broken window frames just to cook thin turnip soup. In the U.S. zone, official rations dropped to 1,000 calories per person, sometimes less. The British zone fared worse at 900 calories. Clay's daily briefings to Washington grew grim. He described a crisis approaching mass famine. In a cable to the War Department, he warned, "We cannot hold the line with empty stomachs." Across the country, malnutrition blurred the line between peace and catastrophe. In Cologne, a priest recorded in his diary, "The bells ring for vespers, and children faint on the steps." Hospitals overflowed. Tuberculosis cases doubled in 6 months. A third of the population in some districts suffered from edema, fluid swelling from protein loss. And yet, amid this misery, the front line of humanity shifted from generals to ordinary soldiers. Every U.S. unit, from infantry detachments to engineers, faced the same moral arithmetic. 1 ration tin, 2 faces staring. The men who had been trained to obey orders found themselves improvising. At dawn, cooks at field kitchens ladled extra portions into small cans before inspection. At night, soldiers packed spare food into makeshift parcels and left them near rubble shelters. In Würzburg, the 10th Armored Division's mess sergeant began saving kitchen grease to trade for potatoes with local farmers, then returned the potatoes to children lining up outside the gate. In Nuremberg, an American medic used his medical rations to feed orphaned toddlers in a bombed-out schoolhouse. These acts, though forbidden, became a silent campaign of mercy. They were small, inefficient, and utterly human. Meanwhile, the situation turned political. Reports of starvation in Germany began leaking into American newspapers. The New York Times ran an editorial titled, "Feeding the Defeated." Protestant and Catholic groups launched campaigns to save Europe's children. Church collections in Iowa and Illinois gathered money for powdered milk shipments, but the numbers remained stubborn. In March 1947, the U.S. Army calculated that Germany required at least 700,000 tons of grain imports to prevent widespread famine. Washington hesitated. The Marshall Plan was still in discussion, and domestic shortages made Congress reluctant. Clay pressed harder. "This is not sentiment," he wrote. "It is survival, for them and for our mission." By April, shipments began increasing, but the distribution system was broken. Bridges washed out by thawing ice. Trains stalled for lack of coal. And in Berlin, 200 miles east, Soviet administrators accused the Western Allies of using hunger as propaganda. For the men on the ground, policy debates meant nothing. They worked by instinct, not instruction. Private Frank W. from Kansas remembered seeing a little girl faint during morning roll call outside a supply depot. He broke open his K-ration box, biscuits, cheese, chocolate, lemon powder, and gave it all to her. "She smiled like I'd given her Christmas," he wrote. "Then I realized it was February." Across hundreds of towns, similar stories echoed. Some were written down. Most weren't. Yet together, they transformed the texture of the occupation. The enemy was no longer faceless. In May 1947, as the thaw finally broke, calorie levels began to rise, slowly. The crisis had been contained, but only just. An estimated 100,000 people had died from hunger-related causes during that winter, but millions more had survived, partly because strangers in uniform had defied orders to share what little they had. The hunger winter ended, but its moral residue remained, in the hearts of soldiers, in the eyes of the children they fed, and in the policy rooms that would soon define the Cold War's first humanitarian triumph. The question remained, how could an occupying army feed an entire population without collapsing its own logistics? That question would be answered the following year, not on the ground, but in the air. At midnight, Soviet forces closed every road, rail line, and canal into West Berlin. The city of 2 million people was suddenly cut off from food, fuel, and medicine. It was the next evolution of hunger, not born of war's destruction, but of strategy. Stalin's blockade was designed to force the Western Allies to abandon Berlin. To make starvation a political weapon, within hours, General Lucius D. Clay, the same man who had once watched children beg outside U.S. kitchens, faced an impossible decision: pull out or feed the city by air. The latter seemed unthinkable. Berlin needed at least 4,500 tons of supplies a day just to survive. No air force in history had ever moved that much cargo for that long. But Clay refused to surrender. "We stay," he said. "We supply by air." On June 26, 1948, the first American C-47s lifted off from Wiesbaden and Rhine-Main airfields, loaded with flour and dried milk. 2 days later, British Dakotas joined them. What began as a desperate experiment quickly became the Berlin Airlift, Operation Victuals for the Americans, Operation Planefare for the British. In the first week, the planes delivered barely enough to feed the city for a day. By the third week, they were landing every 3 minutes, day and night, at Tempelhof and Gatow. Each aircraft carried around 10 tons of cargo. Pilots described the landings as controlled crashes, narrow runways, crosswinds, and fog. But the system worked. Airlift crews developed a rhythm: load, fly, drop, refuel, repeat. The sound of engines became Berlin's heartbeat. To the people below, each plane meant life. Children gathered in parks to watch them thunder overhead, counting their passage like clockwork. They learned the sound of specific aircraft models: C-47s for food, C-54 Skymasters for coal. Every descent was hope made visible. Then came a gesture that transformed survival into something deeper. In July 1948, Lieutenant Gale S. Halverson, a U.S. Air Force pilot from Utah, met a group of German children watching from outside Tempelhof's fence. They were polite, silent, and hungry. But they didn't beg. Halvorsen, moved by their restraint, promised to drop candy for them on his next flight. The children asked how they'd know which plane was his. He smiled and said, "I'll wiggle my wings." The next day, he tied handkerchiefs to chocolate bars and chewing gum, dropped them from his plane as he came in to land, and kept his promise. The children called it Operation Little Victuals. Word spread instantly. Letters poured in. American school children began mailing candy donations to Germany, with notes reading, "For the kids under the planes." Within weeks, Halvorsen and his fellow pilots were dropping hundreds of tiny parachutes each day. Newspapers across Europe covered it. Radio stations dubbed him the Candy Bomber. What had begun as one man's impulse became a symbol of an entire nation's moral power. Meanwhile, the airlift itself grew to unprecedented scale. By September 1948, Allied aircraft were delivering over 5,000 tons per day. By Christmas, the tonnage reached 8,000. Crews flew in snow, ice, and fog, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Over the following 11 months, over 277,000 flights delivered 2.3 million tons of supplies. Every bag of flour, every can of powdered milk, Every bundle of coal was an act of defiance against tyranny, and a testament to logistical genius. But beyond strategy, the airlift carried emotional gravity. It reversed the image of America in German eyes forever. Only 3 years earlier, U.S. bombers had reduced Berlin to ashes. Now, U.S. pilots risked their lives daily to keep its people alive. On May 12, 1949, after nearly a year of failure, Stalin lifted the blockade. The Western Allies had won, not with bullets, but with bread. In the streets of West Berlin, crowds waved at the last descending C-54s. Children held up signs reading, "Danke, Freunde," "Thank you, friends." Halverson and his crew walked through the city to cheers, their uniforms no longer symbols of occupation, but of hope. The Berlin airlift became one of the first great humanitarian triumphs of the post-war world, a living demonstration that mercy could be stronger than fear. Its legacy would echo for decades. The logistical data filled textbooks, the candy drops filled memories, and in the quiet reckoning of history, those who once shared their rations in ruined streets saw their small acts reflected. In the grand arc of nations, what had begun with a single soldier halving his beans in a shattered square had ended with a sky full of wings. The day the blockade ended, May 12, 1949, Berliners woke to silence. No Soviet checkpoints, no halted trains, but the air above the city still thundered with the rhythm of engines. The Allies continued flying for weeks, determined to stockpile food and coal, in case Stalin changed his mind. By the time the last transport touched down, the scale of what had been achieved was staggering. 2.3 million tons of supplies, 277,000 flights, and only 101 Allied fatalities. An astonishingly low number for an operation of that size. The city had survived not by miracle, but by planning, precision, and willpower. For the Americans, the Berlin airlift was more than a victory of logistics. It was the moral culmination of their presence in Europe. The soldiers who had once fought through the continent's destruction now became its guardians of recovery. In Washington, policy caught up with morality. The success of the airlift gave political momentum to the Marshall Plan, formally launched in 1948, but now fueled by a new sense of purpose. Billions of dollars in aid flowed into Western Europe. Grain, machinery, fuel, fertilizer. West Germany became one of its largest beneficiaries. For General Clay, the victory was bittersweet. He retired soon after, leaving behind a Germany that was no longer the beaten enemy of 1945, but the foundation of a new Europe. "We came as conquerors," he told reporters, "but we left as friends." The humanitarian shift reshaped everything, from military doctrine to foreign policy. Feeding civilians had once been an act of defiance. Now it became official policy. Army manuals began including civil affairs and psychological stabilization as integral parts of occupation strategy. The concept of winning hearts and minds was born in those kitchens and flight paths over Berlin. In Germany, the impact ran deeper than calories. Food relief carried symbolism. The American ration, once a reminder of defeat, became a bridge to dignity. Care packages continued arriving well into the 1950s. More than 10 million boxes sent from ordinary Americans to families they would never meet. Inside each was not just nourishment, but a message. You are not forgotten. For children who had grown up in the ruins, this generosity defined their first memory of post-war life. They remembered the smell of chocolate, the roar of airplanes, and the men in olive-drab uniforms who smiled when they waved. Many of those children would grow up to form the backbone of West Germany's democratic generation. Teachers, engineers, and officials who believed, perhaps subconsciously, that compassion and stability could coexist. Economically, the tide began to turn. Factories reopened. The Deutsche Mark, introduced in June 1948, stabilized trade. Food markets revived, and the black market receded. Calorie intake rose to 2,000 per day by 1950. Western Europe's recovery became so rapid that the press coined a phrase for it: the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. But at its heart, that miracle had been seeded not in boardrooms, but in small acts: cans shared, soup ladled, chocolate dropped from a plane. The Americans had come prepared for occupation. What they built, through humanity, was alliance. When the noise of engines finally faded from Berlin's skies, a strange silence settled over the city. Not the silence of fear, but of renewal. For the first time in years, bread was baked without ration cards. Children went to school with lunches wrapped in paper, not dreams, but the memory of hunger never vanished. It became a scar, quiet, instructive, shared. And in that scar, gratitude took root. The children who had once waited at Tempelhof's fences grew up telling stories to their own children about Die Schokoladenflieger, the chocolate flyers. They remembered the soft descent of tiny parachutes, the taste of sweetness after years of bitterness. When Gail Halvorsen returned to Berlin decades later, elderly men and women greeted him with tears, holding the same white handkerchiefs they had waved as children. His gesture, one pilot, one promise, one wiggle of wings, had become legend. The West Berlin city government later named him an honorary citizen. Schools and streets bore his name. Even Soviet newspapers, years later, grudgingly admitted that the American airlift saved lives. But beyond individual memory, the airlift and the acts of compassion that preceded it changed the moral architecture of modern Europe. It proved that victory could evolve into stewardship, that power could serve without conquering. In West Germany, gratitude translated into alignment. The psychological shift was profound. The Americans were no longer occupiers, but protectors. This emotional groundwork made possible the creation of NATO in 1949 and West Germany's eventual inclusion in Western defense structures. The war that had once divided the world now forged an alliance based not only on security, but on shared values, trust born in hunger, sealed by food. Even within the U.S. Army, the memory endured. Military historians referred to the feeding of post-war Germany as the first modern humanitarian operation. From it grew later doctrines that guided interventions in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, always echoing the same principle: stability begins with survival. Culturally, these moments became part of a new American mythology. The soldier no longer appeared only as a liberator or warrior, but as a builder, helper, and bearer of hope. Films, documentaries, and post-war literature memorialized the image of the GI offering chocolate to a child, a universal shorthand for compassion amid ruin. In German textbooks of the 1950s and 1960s, the airlift was described not as an act of charity, but as the first tangible proof that democracy could care. It helped erase some of the moral isolation Germany had felt after 1945. Feeding became a bridge, across ideology, across guilt. By the 1990s, when Berlin was reunited, that bridge still stood in the national psyche. During reunification ceremonies, American veterans were honored alongside German workers who had helped unload planes 50 years earlier. On the 50th anniversary of the airlift, a new monument rose at Tempelhof, 3 great concrete arcs representing the 3 air corridors that had fed the city. Beneath it, a plaque bore the simple inscription, "They gave their lives so others could eat in freedom." And every year, Berliners still bring children there to lay flowers, not for the generals or politicians, but for the pilots, the cooks, the nameless soldiers who shared what they had when there was nothing left to give. In the end, the story of those years was not about aircraft or tonnage or politics. It was about choice, the moment when ordinary men, standing amid the wreckage of the most destructive war in history, chose mercy over vengeance, because empires fall, alliances shift. But the image endures, a soldier bending down in the rubble, handing half his meal to a starving child, and changing history one spoonful at a time. History often remembers wars by their battles, by the places where men fell, not where they knelt. Yet, in the long aftermath of the Second World War, it was not a battle that defined the peace, but a meal. When the guns went silent, the hunger spoke louder, and it was in answering that hunger, one child, one ration, one flight at a time, that a new world quietly began. The American soldiers who shared their food did not act as heroes. They acted as humans. Many could not pronounce the names of the towns they fed, nor imagine the politics their actions would shape. But compassion has a gravity of its own. It pulls nations toward decency, one choice at a time. From that gravity, alliances were born. The Marshall Plan, NATO, and the long peace of Western Europe all carried, hidden in their foundations, the same moral seed planted in 1946, that mercy is not weakness, it is strategy of the highest order. For Germany, the gift of survival became the debt of gratitude. The children who once cupped their hands for chocolate grew into citizens of a rebuilt democracy. The soldiers who shared it returned home changed. Their vision of victory altered forever. And for history, the lesson remained stark and timeless. It is easier to rebuild walls than trust. The men who gave away half their rations helped repair both. Today, when the archives of war are opened and the films replayed, one image still speaks louder than any speech. A uniformed hand offering food across the ruins of an empire. No banners, no orders, just a quiet understanding that humanity, even when rationed, multiplies when shared.